Turn to our questions. And question 1 is in the hands of the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to ask the Treasury Minister at what time and what date the 5p reduction in fuel duty was introduced.
On the Treasury Minister to reply.
Mr Speaker, the temporary cut to fuel duty came into effect from 6 p.m. on the 23rd of March 2022 for a period of 12 months.
Supplementary question, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. On the government website, the statement reads, in accordance with custom excise agreements with the UK, the Isle of Man will also apply this decrease with effect from 6 p.m. tonight, Wednesday the 23rd of March 2022. Doesn't that suggest to consumers that prices would fall at that point? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The way duty works is that the hydrocarbon oils, it's the time at which the goods pass a certain duty point, which determines the rate of duty to be applied. So, for instance, obviously, those retailers that already have fuel in their tank, they've already paid duty on that fuel. In relation to the agreement with the UK, it does form part of our reciprocal agreements around the VAT, and the Isle of Man government is committed to imposing the common duties. So it is as the fuel is released and the retailers buy after the point the duty goes down that duty then is reduced.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. In terms of the cut experienced by Treasury, that's clear. But in terms of the cut experienced by the consumer, that's been slightly more complicated, and there's been a real yo-yoing of prices. Is the Minister able to provide any explanation for that? Some garages' prices fell straight away, then went straight back up. Others fell, then stayed where they were. Others fell, then went back up and have come down again. And there's a real yo-yoing. And people aren't quite sure what's happening, because in terms of the previous answer, there's clarity on where the cut should have happened. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Treasury Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Obviously, what the retailers do once the duty cut is in place is a commercial decision for those retailers in terms of where they pitch their prices. The reduced duty from 57.95p per litre to 52.95 per litre was as per what I have just given the information to the Honourable Member from the 6 p.m. As I say, how or even if the duty is passed on to the customer is entirely in the hands of the retailer from when they start by purchasing that fuel with the reduced duty. But one thing I would say, Mr Speaker, is I was away at Westminster at the back end of last week, and I noticed on Ireland our prices have actually been quite stable at around about the 158 pence for diesel. Petrol stations where I was going past on the train in the UK, it was 191 pence.
Final supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There has been concerns raised about the variance in price on Ireland, which is a concern, but also in terms of a revenue change. With this being based on the general agreement with the UK, will we experience a fall in revenue, or will that just go into the general pot? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
No, Mr Speaker, there is an impact on revenue, obviously, with the duty being reduced. The loss of revenue to government is estimated to be in the region of 2 million to 2.5 million for the 12-month period that the reduction's in place.
Question 2. Call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Cabinet Office what support is available for people from the Ukraine and how many people have inquired about it. Thank you.
Minister for the Cabinet Office to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Isle of Man Government has committed to providing a safe haven for those fleeing the conflicts in Ukraine who may choose to come to the Isle of Man. Preparing for this in order to provide the right support has involved work across government. On arrival, guests from Ukraine will be granted leave to remain here for up to 3 years. This is in line with the approach in the UK and the EU. Council of Ministers has determined that they will have access to education, healthcare and some benefits, and granted the right to work on our island. It is clear too that community support is vital. Officers have been working on creating a custom welcome pack for Ukrainians coming through the routes available, and a guidance document for hosts, which is being prepared, having taken advice from the third sector and the Ukrainian community here. This will outline how to access the services available, what people are eligible for, including offers from the third sector to assist with integration into island life. These documents will be available in English and Ukrainian. I would encourage anyone who's in contact with Ukrainian guests on the island through the current pathways to make themselves known if they haven't already, so that we can provide or signpost to the appropriate support. As of this morning, 18 people have been given leave to come to the island under the family-related immigration pathways. A further 21 applications are in the pipeline through the named individual sponsorship pathway. Officers in the Borders and Immigration team and the Ukraine support team continue to work hard to answer inquiries and process varying offers of support from the community in a timely manner. I am pleased to say that our first guests have already arrived to join their families here. I'm sure all honourable members will join me in wishing them and future arrivals a warm welcome in our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for such a positive answer. In terms of the support for the families offering the accommodation support, the information page is suggesting that is still being looked at. With people already on island, that's something that needs to be considered quite quickly. Is there any indication when there'll be an update on that support? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It will be reviewed. It is under consideration at the moment.
The supplementary, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Has the island the capacity to influence UK immigration services to get family members from Ukraine here more quickly? I'm aware of certain families who are really eager to bring family members over, and there's an issue not with the island, but with the UK side. Is there any influence we can put on that, please? Thank you.
To reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those UK immigration routes, for anybody who's travelling to the island through the UK, that's the system that we have to deal with. We are keeping an eye on it though, and are conscious that it is taking a long time. However, through keeping an eye on what's going on, keeping in touch with the families that are coming here, and also those Ukrainian families who are keeping us posted, keeping the Relief Committee up to speed on how things are working out. We are currently estimating that it's about 7 to 10 days for an application turnaround, and we know in some cases that it is shorter. I think that there is obviously concern here and elsewhere on this, and we are, though, unless we close those routes, we are subject to those processing checks through those particular immigration routes that have been opened up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Final supplementary, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. In the Tynwald debate, innovative methods were suggested in terms of how people could come, possibly things like direct flights. Were any of those alternative methods taken any further forward, and have they been used to get people here? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Officers in the Cabinet Office are in contact with UNHCR and their regional bureau to establish what help we might be able to provide to people who have fled and are currently in countries neighbouring Ukraine. Those conversations are still ongoing. It's not as straightforward as you might think it is, or you might hope for it to be, to get contact with a direct group of people, but as well as talking to UNHCR, we've talked to other authorities in the neighbouring regions, and if there are any further developments, we will update honourable members in due course. Clearly, if there was a different way, an alternative route, a direct way, then there may be other possibilities that kind of get round the processes in the UK. It's still being explored. It needs to be done carefully, and we are trying lots of different routes. The other thing I would raise is that it's important to recognise that through talking to, for example, the Red Cross in Ireland, we're getting indications that a lot of the people that came to Ireland came there because of family roots, and there's also indications too that there is a preference and a will for people to stay in the region. So the point is to make that offer available, to try and find the best way, and members should be assured that we're seeking the best way to do that in different approaches. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question 3, calling the Honourable Member for Garth, Mrs Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture whether primary school leavers' literacy levels have fallen since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and if so, what strategies are being considered to address this?
Call the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The end of Key Stage attainment data at Key Stage 2, when pupils transfer from Year 6 to Year 7, is provided by schools and used to produce aggregated island data. Due to the impact of COVID-19 and a period of industrial action, data was not collected centrally at the Department for the academic year 2019-2020. Therefore, the following data is a comparison of attainment at the end of the academic year 2018-19 to the attainment in the academic year 2020-21, focused on literacy. The data shows that overall in the areas relating to literacy, there has been a decrease in the number of pupils attaining the expected level at the end of Year 6. In speaking and listening, those attaining the expected level of 4B and above at the end of the Year 6 fell by 10.6%, reading by 10.3% and writing by 13.3% when compared to 2018-19. There was also a decrease in the numbers of pupils attaining above the expected levels at the end of Year 6, 4A and above. In speaking and listening, the number of pupils attaining above expected levels fell by 19.3%, reading by 7.7% and writing by 17.3%. Schools and the department are aware of the impact of these figures on future pupil outcomes, and we are working with schools to ensure that measures are taken to narrow the gaps. Schools are best placed to decide the most appropriate intervention or support, and this will vary depending on the context and need. This may take the form of specific interventions matched carefully to the identified needs of the pupil and will be delivered by appropriately skilled adults with results monitored carefully. Schools will be responsible for assessing the needs of pupils and deciding on the best provision to be delivered, with support from the Education Advice and Support Division, where appropriate. The department is setting up a literacy working group which will look at the overall general provision across key stages, including Key Stage 2 and 3, and this will involve the creation of a literacy framework. This will advocate a broad and balanced approach to literacy and will cover a range of elements, including developing oral language, phonics, reading, comprehension, vocabulary, spelling, and how to foster the enjoyment of reading. There will also be opportunities for teaching and support staff with CPD to support them generally with literacy, including further phonics training for specific targeted interventions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that lengthy answer. But it would seem that across the board there is a trend of a reduction in attainment at the end of Year 6, and she will be aware that every school and college in England is going to have more money to support schools, amounting to a total cash increase of £1,500 per pupil in 2019-20 to 2024-25, and this is also going to support delivery of a £30,000 starting salary for all new teachers. So what hard cash is the department putting in to invest in our young people? Another scheme that UK is doing is providing support for university students to provide remedial reading for students who have missed out on much of their education, for COVID catch-up lessons. What investment is the department putting into Year 6 and primary education? What hard cash and resources? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, the honourable members focusing on primary. However, as a department, we're focusing on and trying to make sure the best outcomes for all of our students, and obviously we'll use our resources, our current resources, in accordance with that. With regards to additional funding, I am working with the Treasury on ensuring that there is a full funding review to make sure that the funding is appropriate for the department for the current provision. But with regards to catch-up, which I hope we don't become the catch-up generations, we as a department are looking at the best options and ways forward, working with our schools and school leaders to deliver that.
Supplementary question, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that is the average data, is the data available for the lower quartile? And if it's not available now, could it be made available to us later today? And are additional resources being provided for those schools experiencing the lowest figures and also the biggest falls? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have the specific data that the honourable members requested. However, I will ensure that's circulated to honourable members. And as I've said in my previous answer, we are looking at the best ways forward to deliver appropriate, targeted intervention for the students that require it, and that will be across all our schools.
Supplementary, Dr. Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister aware the recent Ofsted report has showed that actually children entering school now are behind in terms of social development, language development? Some of that's being blamed on wearing masks and not being able to see the mouth being forming sounds and stuff like that. And so where she doesn't want this to be the catch-up generation, I think we are indeed in the catch-up generation. And actually, although this is being seen when we assess children at the end of Key Stage 2, it's going to work right the way through. So what measures are in place across the board to try and address some of these catch-up requirements, please?
Question specifically about primary school leavers. Minister?
Yeah, thank you. And obviously the honourable member has gone outside the questioning. However, we are, as a government, doing a childcare strategy which will be involving nurseries, and part of that will be ensuring that there is an education element. At present, when the students come from nursery into school, we don't necessarily know what level they're at that point. But with regards to progression for students and obviously wearing masks, we are doing our utmost to ensure that all of our students have the best outcomes as an individual.
Supplementary question, Mrs Kane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Education Minister, does she feel the attainment measures currently used in primary school are helpful in determining the outcomes for our young people? Does she think it's appropriate? They're very hard to find. They're not open on the schools, and obviously there hasn't been any assessment or quality assessment undertaken of our schools during the pandemic. So is there going to be a wholesale change in terms of what we measure, how we best support young children to achieve their potential? Should it be more on an individual focused progress of individual students? And again, how is this going to be managed without a massive injection of investment? So while the working groups are looking at strategies, what help is there on the ground now for the Year 6 leavers this year, last year and next year? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very aware that our professionals, our teachers, are working hard with their students to make sure they attain the best outcomes for them as an individual. With regard to whether the attainment, the difficulty to find any of this information, I am committing to be open and transparent and ensuring what data is available is published, and I will ensure that happens. With regards to a baseline assessment of the provision, I've also committed to ensuring that we do that baseline assessment of the provision available, and we have a baseline to then move forward and ensure, and I totally agree with the honourable member, with it should be about progress.
Final supplementary, Mrs Kane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd ask the Minister, do we have a world-class education system on the island? Did we have 10 years ago? Are we at the same level now, would she feel, or has there been a decade of lack of investment in schools?
We're getting into a wider education debate. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think we have an excellent education system where we have very committed employees that have worked extremely hard during the pandemic to try and ensure that all of our students had access to some form of education. Do we need to invest going forward in our education system? Yes, we do.
Question 4, calling the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture what is being done to attract and retain teaching staff.
Call the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer to my answers within this Honourable Court on both the 1st of March and the 8th of March. Contained within the Department's implementation plan following the Beeman's review is an organisational development plan with a focus on creating an environment in which people can thrive and are enabled to contribute their full talents by adapting systems and developing behaviours to improve effectiveness. A number of activities embedded in the plan are focused on the retention of our staff. This includes developing a leadership development framework, creating formal secondment opportunities, reviewing the recruitment process to include values and assessment centres usage where beneficial, promoting and facilitating coaching and mentoring programmes across the organisation, and promoting CPD programmes which are linked to the departmental vision and strategic priorities. It is important that the organisational plan allows for delivery through the involvement of our people, allowing an employee voice. The plan encourages involvement within the projects identified within this with task and finish groups, and they are currently ongoing, including staff from across the organisation and schools. There's also a secondary teacher recruitment working group comprising of colleagues from the Department of Enterprise and the Office of Human Resources to review and improve recruitment for secondary teachers. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Question, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. With regard to the task and finish groups, would it be possible to provide members with a list of those that are currently ongoing? And in terms of the phrase work-life balance, we've all heard of the phrase, but in terms of the answer, it's still about performance, it's still about within schools. Has anything been done to actually get the work-life balance correct? Many teachers have approached me recently about the stress, the tension, all the things that are making the working environment more and more difficult. Has actually been considered? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We always consider the well-being of our staff, and in a previous answer to the Honourable Member for Douglas South with regards to cover supervisors, we are looking at that to ensure that we implement something in September to try and alleviate some of the stresses which teachers have highlighted with regards to cover, with regards to what we are doing for all of the staff. Health, well-being and obviously supporting our staff is a key priority, and we will continue to do that. With regards to recruitment and retention, I've been fortunate this week to be involved in the 2 head teacher appointments, and I came out of those interviews inspired by the true professionals that were in front of me.
Question, Mr Kane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I go back to a previous question I asked, with the UK promising that all new teachers will start on a salary of £30,000. Will the government here, the department here, consider that even ahead of the UK to ensure that we attract or remain attractive to new teachers? But also, are other aspects being looked at? I'm hearing teachers just simply can't afford to stay in the profession. So are other aspects such as housing support being considered, as well as an increase of starting salaries? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And yes, I can confirm that I was quite concerned to see that the housing support hadn't been increased for a number of years, and we do need to look at that as a way forward. With regards to the starting salary of teachers, we are linked to the UK teachers' pay scales, and therefore we would implement as appropriate. With regards to attracting people and an incentive to come to the Isle of Man, yes, we do need to look at that. As similar to in the 80s, there was different packages available to teachers.
Question, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Just referring back to the first answer, reference was made to task and finish groups. Could you provide some detail for members about that? Because we've not really heard about that before. It sounds quite interesting. With reference to the previous answer, you made reference to the housing support. In a previous answer, you said it was being reassessed, and you've just said it needs to be looked at. Are there any definite dates when something concrete will come through? Because that's a real priority for many of the teaching staff. And also in terms of that offering, can it be made available for all teaching staff? Because I'm aware of teaching staff who've come back to the island are often locked out of such schemes. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr Reply.
Yes, apologies. Yes, I mean that I am currently looking at it, and I will ensure that something is forthcoming. With regards to the task and finish groups, happy to circulate the representative bodies of that and what they are looking at. And also with regards to the final question, should it be in place for all teachers? I understood from the last administration as one of the biggest challenges with regard to that it is. If the Honourable Member is now advising that that isn't the case, we do need to look at that. But we also need to look at creative ways of teachers newly coming into the profession and perhaps their outstanding student loans and grants as well.
Final supplementary question, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. The Minister's probably aware about the Golden Hello system currently being used in the UK to attract teachers. If the phrase was used on the Isle of Man Google website last week, it threw out a page from the government website from 2017, which was completely uninspiring, completely dated and completely unattractive. Can we actually look at the communication channels when these young, inspirational teachers are looking where to go in the world, and they go to the government website and see something that was from the dark ages? It's not going to do it. Can we please make it look as good as it is? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm not sure where the member went. I have looked at this and it takes me to the locate.im for teachers site, but if you could point that out to me, I'll make sure that's corrected. But yes, we do need to have an inspirational, attractive advert.
Question 5. Call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture how much has been spent on capital schemes and refurbishment work at the National Sports Centre in each of the last 5 years. Thank you.
Education, Sport and Culture to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The spend at the National Sports Centre on capital and refurbishment over the previous 5 years and the current year to date is 2016-17, 621,622, 2017-18, 770,496, in 2018-19, 2,818,106, in 2019-20, 11,958, apologies. In 2020-21, 205,337, and this year to date, 194,691.
Question, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Why is the investment at the NSC been so high over the period of time, and why is it so high compared with the regional pools? Because there seems to be quite a disparity between what's been at the NSC and the wider investments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Honourable Member will be aware that 4.6 million of that figure that I've just provided, combined with refurbishment, was for the capital scheme for the full refurbishment of the NSC, and that was supported by Tynwald. I understand that was the first sort of capital project for the pool of that nature, and that will be beneficial to the island for the next 20 years, that 4.6 million. With regards to the regional pools, they're all independent boards, and the boards have the opportunity to take out loans to do improvements and refurbishments on their premises.
Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. One of the key investments as part of the last period of investment was the flumes. In terms of flumes, are they almost ready to go? Are we completed them? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and certainly we still have one flume out of action. Am I hopeful that that flume will be back up and running soon? Yes, I am. I cannot give a date, though.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was hoping for it to be in the Easter holidays. I'm going to be disappointed again. Will the review that's been mentioned previously look at the disparities in investment and the cause of this across the swimming pools? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Mr reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As announced, we will be doing a full review of all pools, and that includes the NSC.
Question 6. Call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Enterprise what the Department is doing to speed up the provision of support for the installation of solar panels, heat pumps and other energy-efficient measures.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Living Grant Scheme provides support for the energy efficiency measures the Honourable Member refers to in his question. The scheme was originally devised by the Climate Change Transformation Board and DEFRA and is now administered by the Department for Enterprise. Whilst the scheme officially opened to applications on the 1st of October 2021, a number of tasks require completion for it to become fully operational, including the contracting of qualified domestic energy assessors through an open procurement process. The scheme requires a Manx home energy audit to be undertaken prior to any application for financial assistance towards energy improvement works. Grants are only available for items listed in the audit report and in the priority that they are set out. Because of this, the actions listed in the Honourable Member's question may not be available for all applications, as this will depend on the individual property. To date, 1,523 applications have been approved for their Manx home energy audit. Over 14% of home audits have either been completed or scheduled, comprising 135 completed audits and 81 scheduled audits. The Department is aware that the pace of these measures has not been as quick as we would like, and that, with hindsight, the scheme is too prescriptive. Therefore, the Department is looking at ways to open it up further and speed it up. This is particularly important given the current situation with energy prices, and I hope that Honourable Members will be able to support such proposals when they are brought forward. The Department also has a business energy savings scheme which provides up to £20,000 of loan support. We are also looking at reforming this further. Thank you.
Question, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. In terms of the reviews, is it possible that all houses will potentially become suitable for this type of investment and support? And at the current moment in time, is there any indication how long people are having to wait to get their applications processed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Answering the second point, as I've said, we are rolling out the assessment process as quickly as possible. The current scheme, as approved by Tynwald, only provides grants to those houses assessed as level D or below, and the details are on the DFE website. Because of that, it's not open to all households. However, this scheme was devised at a time when carbon emissions was the key priority. As the Chief Minister has set out in his statement, we are now really looking at the cost of energy as well as emissions. And so we are looking at widening the scheme, speeding up the scheme, so that we can actually reduce people's energy prices and so help them deal with some of the increases in the energy costs that our islands and other jurisdictions have experienced over the last few months. Thank you.
Question, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 23rd of March 2022, VAT on energy-saving materials like solar panels became zero registered, mounted. Has this actually boosted demand, and has the department got the capacity to manage that increased demand going forward? Because we won't want kind of the department bureaucracy to diminish people's enthusiasm for this change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the Treasury Minister pointed out, this is a welcome benefit in terms of VAT reduction on certain products. We have seen good uptake in the scheme and a lot of applications. I think the Honourable Member does raise a very valid question, which is in terms of the capacity of the construction industry to provide this work, and also the supply chain for some of these bits of equipment. We are working with Construction Isle of Man in terms of how we can reskill some of their workers in terms of energy efficiency measures, and we'll continue to do that. Thank you.
Final supplementary, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Is there an indication of how much has actually been allocated to this area since the grants became available? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In terms of how much money has been given to residents on the Isle of Man, as I said, we have done a lot of assessments. We have not so far given out any money in terms of the complete grant application process, but hopefully we'll do so in the near future.
Into question 7, call the Honourable Member for Douglas North, Mr. Wannenberg. Mr. Wannenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry to wait for you.
I was reading your message. Would the Minister for Health and Social Care tell us what issues there have been with the supply of antiviral drugs and why, and what measures have been taken to address those issues?
Call the Minister for Health and Social Care to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The allocation and distribution of COVID antiviral and neutralising monoclonal antibody treatments across the UK and Crown dependencies is controlled by the Antiviral Task Force based at the UK Department of Health and Social Care. The launch date of the first-line treatment, called Paxlovid, in the UK was the 10th of February, and an allocation of 94 patient courses was agreed with Manx Care. Unfortunately, due to supply issues to the UK from the manufacturer, combined with competing demands from across the home nations and Crown dependencies, this resulted in the delivery to the Isle of Man being delayed until the 11th of March. This was despite regular contact between Noble's Pharmacy Department and the UK DHSC. The second-line treatment, known as Sotrovimab, had been delivered in February. However, it could not be offered until Paxlovid was also available in order to be compliant with the UK prescribing guidelines. Despite these delays, development of the triage, diagnosis and treatment pathways commenced in January, with a working group comprising pharmacists, consultants, senior nursing leaders and representatives from the primary care network, who met several times to agree the process. Given the UK guidance that needs to be followed around assessment against the eligibility criteria, diagnosis of COVID-19 infection from PCR testing, decision-making around first versus second-line treatment, and the logistics of administering medication to a COVID-positive patient in hospital, the pathway took some time to finalise and ratify. The antiviral pathways went live on the 31st of March with signposting via all media channels to the website outlining eligibility criteria and steps on how to access the pathway. Mr. Speaker, antiviral medications are only prescribed for patients who are at most risk of becoming seriously ill if they contract COVID-19. These would be individuals who have received a letter of eligibility from their NHS consultant in the UK, or if they have one of the conditions listed on the antiviral section of the Isle of Man Government COVID website. This information can be found under the General Guidance tab on the COVID website. If someone has received a letter from the NHS or has one of the listed conditions and they do receive a positive lateral flow test, they should then directly contact their GP to check their eligibility and have a PCR test arranged. If the PCR test is then positive, somebody from the antiviral service at Nobles Hospital will make contact to arrange treatment. For most people, this assessment can take place over the phone and the medication can be collected by a family member or a friend. However, for a very small number of people, they will need to attend Nobles Hospital for administration of the medicine via intravenous infusion. This infusion will take place in a dedicated area of the emergency department away from other patients. Nobles Pharmacy will remain in close contact with the antiviral task force in the DHSC to ensure a reliable supply of both Paxlovid and Sotrovimab in the weeks and months to come, to ensure these vital medications remain available to any at-risk individual who tests positive for COVID-19.
Question, Mr. Wallenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. If I could just read this part of this press release which the Manx Care Chief Exec put out recently, where she says that antivirals are a choice. However, we would encourage anyone with a COVID positive result who meets our criteria to have treatment. That has not been the case for my constituent. It has been far from it. She has met all the criteria which the Minister has just laid out. She was denied the antivirals because there weren't any on the island for her. So when the system fails her, it fails all of us. And I think I have to ask the Minister, is that press release disingenuous given the fact that my constituent didn't receive any antivirals? Thank you.
Minister's reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said in my original answer, the antiviral pathways went live on the 31st of March. So if his constituent had tried accessing antivirals after that date, it's definitely a conversation that we should have to make sure if they are eligible, they do get access to those treatments. If they tried accessing the service before that date, as I've outlined in my answer, they were not available. That's nothing I can do about changing the past, unfortunately. The delays I outlined inside the original answer as to the cause of that, including delays in delivery of the actual drugs to the Isle of Man and delays as a result of trying to get the pathways up and running following that delivery.
Mr. Wallenberg, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I repeat that when we fail our constituents, we fail them all. And we can put dates on these things, but when someone has invasive breast cancer, then surgery, and then is denied treatment, we are failing them. And that's all I can say on that. Thank you.
Didn't detect a question there. We turn then to question 8, and I call on the Honourable Member for Wishing, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister of Infrastructure what initiatives are in place to give effect to the Fabric First approach and what funding options are available to local authorities to support improvements to their social housing stock.
Call on the Minister for Infrastructure to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Buildings designed and constructed using the Fabric First approach aim to minimise the need for energy consumption through methods such as maximising air tightness, using super high insulation, optimising solar gain through the provision of openings and shadings, optimising natural ventilation, using the thermal mass of the building fabric, and using the energy from occupants, electronic devices, cookers, etc. Focusing on the building fabric first is generally considered to be more sustainable than relying on energy-saving technology or renewable energy generation, which can be expensive. Local authority housing stock is owned by the local authority, who receive income from the tenant's rent, and the local authority is responsible for the maintenance of the properties. Where local authorities are unable to finance improvement works or new build schemes through their housing income, they can apply for permission to borrow money through petition under Section 51 of the Local Government Act 1985. Any requests for borrowing are considered by the Department in order to ensure that they are appropriate, economic and value for money. Local authorities are also able to request borrowing through a Treasury-backed loan arrangement, currently through the HSBC, and as part of this they petition my department and the Treasury for approval to use this arrangement on a scheme-by-scheme basis. Where the local authority is unable to meet the cost of their housing maintenance works and loan repayments, my department supports the local authority through housing deficiency payments.
Supplementary question, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, and I thank the Minister for the answer. It's obviously easier to start the Fabric First approach from the design stage. Can I ask what his department has sought in the way of training for officers and for local authorities to help them understand this approach? And have they adjusted any of their instructions to any of their contracted designers or architects to ensure that future developments are built in line with the Fabric First approach? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As far as training goes, I'm not sure what training has been given, but I will find out for the honourable member and distribute that to honourable members. And I'm sure that the department now that have taken up this fabric first approach on every project that comes forward now are pushing this, and it should be the way forward in the future.
Since question 9, call on the honourable member for Oncombe, Mr. Callister.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister for Infrastructure what his department is doing to encourage more people to use public transport, and what consideration has been given to capping bus fares on the island?
Will the Minister for Infrastructure to reply?
Thank you very much. The bus network review in 2012 reorganised bus services to meet modern needs and encourage more people to use the public transport. As a result of increased frequencies in key areas and the bus fares remaining at the same at the April 2013 level, we have, prior to COVID, seen a 52% increase in bus travel. We will continue to hold the fares and frequencies as long as we can, despite the inflationary pressures, which will continue to make the bus an attractive option. Fortunately, so far, inflationary increases have since been covered by the increasing numbers of bus passengers. It is difficult at the present time to predict what further increases in fuel prices may occur, but we will continue to monitor and only increase fares if we need to. If the question means capping as a maximum cost per day or for other periods, then the current fares are effectively capped, with the day ticket costing £7 and the day ticket and the 5-day ticket, £19 and the 7-day ticket £23. Tickets are also available for 28 days and for a year, and all, I would say, are probably excellent value compared to the using of cars and car parking prices. It is hoped that further increases in passenger numbers may be achieved, reflecting the pressure on family budgets and our environmental aims of reducing car use that could just be a side effect. Despite increases in fuel prices, I will try to resist a fair price as long as possible, and will look to alternative ways to encourage passenger use. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Mr. Callister.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just ask the Minister for clarification on the statement? Because in the Chief Minister's statement this morning, he mentioned that government is considering an initiative for cheaper journeys on public transport. That was the statement from the Chief Minister this morning. So can I ask the Minister if he will be introducing cheaper fares in order to encourage and to help people get through this cost of living situation that we're facing? Because it seems to go against, your statement seems to go slightly against the Chief Minister. Can you just clarify the position, please?
Minister.
Happy to do that, Mr. Speaker. In the past, they have been capped, as I said, with those tickets, day tickets or weekly tickets or yearly tickets. We are absolutely looking at the moment of ways of encouraging people, and that would probably include bringing the prices down to encourage people to use public transport rather than using their own vehicles. I would say, though, we have to look at the situation. Obviously, there's a huge cost implication here with regards to wages, but fares as well. But we are absolutely looking at this, like the Chief Minister said in his speech this morning.
Supplementary question, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has previously made mention to the potential to offer free fares on certain days. Has that been progressed? And if not, is there an indication when there'll be an announcement on it? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister to reply.
That is still part and parcel of what we're looking at, Mr. Speaker. As to when and where that will come about, I don't know, but I'm sure either myself or the Chief Minister in another statement will let honourable members know as soon as possible.
Supplementary question, Mr. Callister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Several cities in the UK have introduced capping of fares to encourage more people to use public transport, to get them out of the car, especially getting to work and to get to the shops. They've also, especially Greater Manchester, are going to allow local authorities to have a greater input into the routes and setting some of those routes in order to connect our towns and villages. Would the Minister consider this option when looking at the next bus timetable?
Minister to reply.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, earlier this year there will be a full review of bus services anyway, and we would expect all local authorities to take part in that.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Corlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister's answered part of my question, because I wanted to ask him, was he going to review bus routes, as large swathes of the Douglas Central constituency, the bus services were cut completely. And I'd like to ask the Minister, would he agree that actually, in order to encourage people to use public transport more, we actually need a bus service to do that?
Minister to reply.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I've had conversations with the Honourable Member about this, and as part of that review that will certainly take place and we will look at that. And if circumstances change in the foreseeable future, as I've said with regard to this original question, and it needs more buses up in that area to include people, to encourage people to come into town, then that will be done. So happy to talk to the member any time.
Why do I have the feeling we're going to go constituency by constituency now? Mr Johnson.
I promise not to mention the northern area particularly on this matter. No, it was building on from that really. It's actually, obviously we talk about the costs involved in public transport, but it's making sure that the bus services are relevant to people's lives and fit in. And so the timetable, I think, is really important as well to encourage more people and looking a bit broader on that issue and making sure that is the case in the future.
Minister.
Timetabling is absolutely essential, Mr Speaker, and we've had conversations again with the Honourable Member who's just resumed his seat. But when it comes down to things like the hospitals issuing appointments, if people from certain areas can get their times, say people from Ramsey can get their times on a Monday, then we can make sure that there's enough bus services there for those people rather than using their cars and things like that. But it is something absolutely that we should be looking at.
Mr Warrenberg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would the Minister agree that the bus, van and app is fit for purpose, given the significant investment that's been put into it? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
As far as I know, Mr Speaker, I would say it's fit for purpose. I've had a lot of compliments personally from people out and about it and said that it's quite handy to sit in a public house or in a restaurant and just know that your bus is leaving Douglas if you're in Peel and you've got 20 minutes to finish your dinner and get to it. But if he has any complaints, I'm happy to take those. But as far as I know, people said they're happy with that.
Final supplementary question, Mr Collister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister mentioned costs, and there may be additional costs, but I'd like to question why. Because in 2018-19, there was 3.7 million journeys made on the Isle of Man. The question is, many of our buses outside the peak times are actually empty. So the question is, the costs are already being incurred, the drivers, the maintenance, all of that's being encouraged. So the question is, will the Minister consider looking at capping fares to encourage more people to use the buses that are already running around our island half empty? Thank you.
Yes, I've already said I'm willing to look at those, and the extra costs just refer to the fuel situation at the moment, Mr Speaker, but I'm happy to speak to the Honourable Member afterwards.
Since question 10, I call on the Honourable Member for Rushden, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for Infrastructure how fire safety systems for hydrocarbon infrastructure in Douglas Harbour are managed and funded.
On the Minister for Infrastructure to reply.
The Department of Infrastructure manage the fire control system, which is located in a building within the Battery Pier Yard. The system consists of 3 independent fire pumps which supply water to both the Manx gas and the Manx petroleum storage sites, together with the discharge jetty fire monitors. The system is fully automatic and in the case of a fire alarm activation, will alert the Manx Fire and Rescue Service and start the fire pumps. In addition, manual pump starts are located at strategic locations. The intakes consist of a submersible hydraulic pump which are located next to the steps adjacent to the R&I station in the harbour. These pumps supply seawater to the main fire pumps located in the yard. The system is maintained and tested by the DOI. Staff and dive inspections to the water intakes are part of this process. The annual engine service is carried out under a service contract with Caterpillar dealer findings, and they are also carrying out repairs that are required to the 3 engines. The original installation was completed in 2011 through a capital project, and the ongoing maintenance is funded therein from Harbours Division maintenance budget, and on the more expensive elements, the Department's strategic structural maintenance budget. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Dr Hayward.
Thank you. As that system is serving 2 private companies, how has that cost burden ended up with his department, and why is that cost not passed on to the customers that you are servicing?
Minister to reply.
Mr Speaker, I don't have that information, but I'm happy to find that out and distribute that to members. I'm sure it was an agreement that was made at the time to ensure that the businesses are kept viable on the quay there. But happy to find out.
Question 11, call on the Honourable Member for Douglas North, Mr Warrenberg.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. You will recall that you have agreed to defer that question until when the Honourable Member is back.
I do. I forgot to annotate my order paper accordingly. Thank you very much. It's my turn to wake up, Mr Warrenberg. Which takes us to question 12. The Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture when postgraduate support for students awarded 2-2 degrees was last assessed. Thank you.
For the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Postgraduate support for students awarded a 2-2 degree was last assessed in 2019 and the updated regulations were unanimously approved by Tynwald on the 22nd of May 2019. A student must achieve at least a 2-1 in their undergraduate degree as a minimum requirement to qualify support for a postgraduate degree course. A public consultation seeking views on key policy principles of student awards was conducted last year as part of a full review of the regulations. The responses to this consultation are being used to inform and fully update the regulations in line with the island's plans, commitment and vision to offer outstanding lifelong learning and development opportunities for all. The outcome of that review is nearing to completion and my department will put recommendations to the Council of Ministers in due course. However, any cost implications will be subject to Treasury funding. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Does the Minister recognise the lost potential of these students, and could anything be done to capture this potential at a time when we need more teachers and more hospital employees? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Yes, and certainly that is a commitment within the island plan that we are looking at this and looking at ways, and we are also looking at ways of doing, particularly for teachers, teacher training on island again in the near future.
Supplementary question, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Has the Minister any data from the last 3 years, and if not, could it be provided at a later date, to show how many students applied for support for postgraduate qualifications but were turned down because of the 2-2 award that they've been previously given? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Out of the students who have applied to the Department for funding in the past 3 years, there have only been 4 students who were turned down due to a 2-2 degree marking.
Supplementary question, Mrs Kane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister give any indication what the outcomes of the consultation were? And given the implication that perhaps the funding could be widened to those with a 2-2, could she say whether she feels that that would be beneficial in terms of healthcare workers that the Isle of Man desperately needs to encourage to return to the island and work in the health settings? And also, if it is permitted, would the second and third year of postgraduates who maybe are continuing with their postgraduate studies who did not receive a 2-1, would they qualify for future years funding if the criteria was changed?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I've said, we are doing a review of it. Of the 4 people that we know that have been refused funding because of a 2-2, there was only 1 looking to go into education or health. But with regard to the wider question, with regards to health and education staff, we are working with the DHSC currently due to a number, and I know a number of colleagues in here have had emails from people with regards to this subject, but looking at bursary options going forward, and also when obviously any order goes through Tynwald, it will be effective from the date of any changes.
Final supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In terms of the possible changes, is there an indicative date when that will happen? Because many students are actually looking now at postgraduate courses and it's very time relevant. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would be aiming to do that as soon as possible, but obviously we need to ensure that it's the right scheme that's coming forward. But with regards to any students that are in that situation, there is also the VTAS scheme. You know, and we have advised some people that have come to us with a 2-2 that they can also look at the VTAS scheme for support up to 50%.
Thank you. That concludes questions for all answers this morning.